Ever since the Mimic was first brought up in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, there's been a lot of debate over whether or not Burntrap and Glitchtrap are the Mimic or William Afton. And while I have covered this topic in the past, we've gotten a lot of information in the past year and a half since my last video. From the creator of the franchise, Cawthon, addressing his original plans for the characters, to a new game, to details in past games that either weren't initially obvious or have been cast into new light. There's a lot to go off of that's not only been used as evidence for all sides of the debate, but also for the idea that Burntrap in his entirety was retconned and no longer exists. And with all the information we now have on the table, I think there's some major things that have either been overlooked or majorly misinterpreted when discussing these theories. So stay tuned and consider subscribing, because I think we have enough evidence to figure out what's really going on with Burntrap, Glitchtrap, and the Mimic in the current FNAF lore, and it's not what the majority seem to think. But first, since it's been about 6 years since we were first introduced to even one of these characters, I'm going to give everyone a quick refresher on the relevant information from the current arc of games, just so we're all on the same page about what's actually out there in the first place. Help Wanted was a VR game that had in-universe minigames of FNAF 1 through 3 and elements from FNAF 4. While some theorize that this means that the original FNAF games were entirely fictional in universe, I don't personally find that likely, considering the point of the VR game was to discredit and make light of what actually happened, presumably by passing off the real events as fictional games, which I would like to note don't include the lore minigames or certain elements like Golden Freddy that were in the originals. Anyway, throughout Help Wanted, you can find these recordings from a character known as Tape Girl, a beta tester for the game who documented weird things involving and surrounding the game's development. Most of these focused on something she referred to as the anomaly. The anomaly, Glitchtrap, manifests as a fabric costume version of the original Spring Bonnie animatronic that the main villain of the franchise, William Afton, used, just with a paler color, purple eyes, and a purple vest. As the tapes are collected, Glitchtrap shows up in the main hub and moves closer and closer to the player. Though that being said, it does have a chance to show up without that and will show up in one of the game's endings regardless. Specifically the Pizza Party ending, where Glitchtrap lures the player to a party recreating William Afton luring the missing kids he killed, before stuffing you in a Freddy suit and dancing in the background. But it appearing from the logs being collected in the hub world is likely connected to how Tape Girl mentions it's connected to her audio logs, especially since when Glitchtrap appears in the hub world, a distorted version of one of her recordings plays. Anyway, from the tapes, we learned that Glitchtrap originally showed up after circuit boards were given to the original development studio that were scanned into the game, supposedly for pathfinding purposes. The circuit boards were later stolen back, but by that point, Glitchtrap was already in the game and was first seen by the previous beta tester, Jeremy, who ended up having nightmares, holding conversations with people who weren't there, and eventually sliced what's described as a Halloween mask off of his face using a paper slicer. Tape Girl tried to deal with Glitchtrap by breaking her logs into pieces, but by finding all the tapes, not only do we get a couple recordings from Tape Girl that imply she got Glitchtrapped herself, if it wasn't just Glitchtrap stealing her voice, but the player character, Vanessa, gives Glitchtrap the power to mentally merge with her and have her become the character Vanny. The now defunct mobile game Special Delivery takes place afterwards and has two main storylines. One is about how a company that was contracted by Fazbear to run an animatronic delivery service ended up scanning a circuit board for them that uploaded a virus onto their servers that's implied to be Glitchtrap. Meanwhile, we find out that Vanessa has been displaying worrying behavior to her coworkers, such as Googling stuff like how to induce compliance in human subjects and how far can a human being be cut in half before losing consciousness. Then, based on the books, some unreleased emails, and the therapy recordings from Security Breach, a kid named Gregory, while under the control of Glitchtrap for reasons we aren't currently aware of, uploaded Glitchtrap into the new Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex, and Vanessa let it through even after it was quarantined. Then we get into Security Breach, where it appears that Gregory is no longer under Glitchtrap's control, doesn't seem to remember having been controlled in the first place, and is being hunted down by Vanessa and all of the animatronics besides Glamrock Freddy, who spends most of the game in safe mode and only becomes hostile when his low power mode takes him out of that. Gregory spends the game upgrading Freddy with parts from the other Glamrock animatronics while he waits for the doors to open, and after making it to an exit, there are 6 potential endings from the game, though there are 2 that are primarily relevant to this video. As a note here, I will be treating all of the endings as things that could have happened in the story or are lore relevant even if they didn't actually happen, at least for the game itself, since that's how things operate with other games that have multiple endings like Pizzeria Simulator, FNAF 3, Sister Location, and Secret of the Mimic. Whatever may or may not actually be intended to be relevant is something I will get to, but later in the video. Anyway, the first important ending is the Princess Quest ending, which can only be achieved if Gregory finds and beats the 3 Princess Quest arcade games, of which an alternate version of one is actually in the mobile port of Help Wanted. The Princess Quest games have a few things to take note of. There are gravestones that Help Wanted 2 confirms to line up with William's victims, there's an old man who Help Wanted 2 implies to be Old Man Consequences from FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night, and the third game is essentially a recreation of Help Wanted, with the same hub area, items, and even the DLC's Foxy Maze. And then, of course, there are the connections to Glitchtrap. The enemies are these glitchy glitchy rabbit monsters. Beating the first game shows this glitchy purple rabbit blob that has a coded message saying "I always come back," with audio that when reversed and sped up says "I always come back, let me out." And in Princess Quest 3, by collecting the Vanny mask and green rabbit plush and using them to get a key, you can find and open the door that Glitchtrap locked Vanessa behind in Help Wanted, causing a scream to ring out and Glitchtrap's influence over the Pizzaplex and Vanessa to be released. Meanwhile, the other important ending is the Burntrap ending, where Gregory stays in the Pizzaplex, gets the one animatronic upgrade for Freddy that he missed while previously making the rounds, and heads underneath the Pizzaplex. When Gregory and Freddy go there, they find out that the Pizzaplex was built on top of the FNAF 6 Pizzeria Simulator location, where William Afton's former business partner, Henry Emily, gathered and lured the haunted animatronics to set everything ablaze and finally bring William and the pain he caused to an end. Not only that, but in the building's basement, there's a charging pod, and from that charging pod emerges Burntrap, a burnt, modified Spring Bonnie animatronic with human flesh and bones, looking suspiciously like what William Afton would look like after being set on fire in Pizzeria Simulator and repaired with other animatronic parts. By putting his hand on the computer screen, Burntrap is able to hack Freddy, which Gregory has to stop by setting Burntrap on fire, and after doing so enough times while fending off the attacking Glamrock animatronics, Gregory and Freddy escape the building, and Burntrap gets captured by an amalgamation of animatronic parts known as the Blob or the Tangle. After this, the events of Help Wanted 2 take place, where a Fazbear Entertainment technician ends up in the Pizzeria Simulator location under the influence of a Vanny mask that makes him see an augmented reality version of the location that looks like it's in good repair while he's wearing it. While Burntrap himself doesn't make an appearance, Glitchtrap does by interfering with the minigames, appearing to hand the player dolls with masks of William's victims that are referred to as memories, and showing up in both endings. In one of the endings, by collecting all of Glitchtrap's memory plushies, you can play the Princess Quest 4 arcade cabinet, which eventually has the player light the graves from the original Princess Quest, now with the memory plushies propped up against them, and come to the character that's implied to be Old Man Consequences. The player gives him the Vanny mask in exchange for the green rabbit plushie, which he calls a fair trade, before the wall opens into the sister location elevator, which isn't super important for this video, but is interesting to note. And after descending, you end up in a claw machine with a giant Vanny looking in. The moon animatronic comes in, takes the rabbit plush and drops it down the chute, and Vanny takes it out, with the plushie manifesting in her hands as Glitchtrap, who she then squashes before fading away into the darkness. In the other ending, you collect these little action figures of the FNAF 1 animatronics and the puppet, which combine to give you the 7th action figure, which looks like Glitchtrap. The player's vision glitches out, and one of the security breach charging pods appears on the stage. As the door slides open, Glitchtrap's hand comes out to grab the door, and after the screen cuts to black, Nightmare staff bots converge on the player, static plays on screen, and the player wakes up with the point of view of the mask bot at the beginning of Security Breach's Ruin DLC, giving a Vanny mask to a young girl named Cassie. Cassie had gone into the Pizzaplex supposedly at the request of her friend Gregory, who was supposedly trapped in the Pizzaplex. I'm saying supposedly so much because it wasn't actually Gregory, but rather a new-to-the-games character called the Mimic. During Ruin, the Mimic uses a walkie-talkie to pretend to be Gregory while also hijacking the Helpy program of the Vanny mask to communicate with Cassie, and lure her into disabling the security nodes around the building that can only be accessed through the Vanny mask, giving access to the AR world. However, a blue rabbit entity in the AR world connected to the security systems tries to stop Cassie from doing so. Once all the security nodes are disabled, Cassie goes down to the Pizzeria Simulator location below the abandoned Burntrap room and eventually finds another room that has a computer monitor, a giant old computer labeled Mixes, and a concrete wall. Deactivating Mixes shows that the blue rabbit entity was tied to it and allows Cassie to break down the concrete wall, revealing that the Mimic endoskeleton was the Gregory speaking to Cassie through the walkie-talkie. After a chase sequence where a different Gregory, who may or may not actually be the real Gregory, directs Cassie onto an elevator to escape, Gregory explains what's going on to Cassie, only for a static noise and overlapping text to signal a shift from Gregory trying to save Cassie to supposedly not wanting to anymore and dropping the elevator. It was only recently that we got the Mimic's backstory in the games with the release of Secret of the Mimic a few months ago. The main focus of the games is on Arnold, a technician who was sent by Fazbear Entertainment to grab stuff including the Mimic blueprints from a place called Murray's Costume Manor, which was originally a contractor of Fazbear's up until they seemingly took ownership of it and the surrounding land. While a lot goes on in that game, there are a few major things relevant to this theory that I'm going to touch on for the sake of time. For one thing, we find out that there are actually two Mimics. The first one, M1, imitated the deceased wife of its creator, Edwin, but was put into a suspiciously Mexes-shaped computer after Edwin realized she wasn't actually his wife. Edwin then created the M2 program from a copy of M1 and stuck it in the Mimic endoskeleton. M2 ended up starting to imitate Edwin's deceased son, David, and Edwin reacted violently, leading to the Mimic imitating that. Additionally, the Tales from the Pizzaplex books imply that Edwin's anger itself was infused into the Mimic when he attacked it there, so I expect the same happened in the games. Additionally, there are three main endings. One is where Arnold hands over the blueprints at the request of the dispatch agent guiding him throughout the game, gets kidnapped by M2, and stuffed in a prototype Freddy Fazbear suit to perform while M2 watches. The other two reveal that M1 was pretending to be dispatch for most of the night, and that there's a prototype of the FNAF 1 location, with some similar elements to Help Wanted's hub world, underneath the building. One of the endings from there ends with Arnold Arnold activating Mixes, which was built to contain the Mimic, and escaping only to have his car crashed and the blueprint stolen back by the Mimic. And the other ends with M2 being calmed and fully taking on David's identity before going to sleep. And if you want help going to sleep, you should check out the sponsor of this video, Mantasleep. Sometimes falling asleep and staying asleep can be hard, especially if you have a window that lets in sunlight, roommates who wake up earlier than you do, or you want to take a nap before it gets dark out. Fortunately, Mantasleep can be a great help for that. Mantasleep has a variety of comfortable sleep masks that have adjustable straps and special eye cups that completely block out light without pressing on your eyes. I personally have the Manta Pro sleep mask, which is engineered with C-shaped eye cups for side sleepers, and the Manta Sound sleep mask, which has discreet razor-thin Bluetooth speakers that's been great for helping me listen to music to fall asleep without bothering my roommates. I use one of the two of them pretty much every single day, and I genuinely highly recommend them if you're interested. And hey, if you use the link in the description, pinned comment, and on-screen QR code, or code IDs Fantasy, you can get 10% off your order and help support the channel in the process. So make sure to check them out. But back to the topic at hand, while initially Glitchtrap and Burntrap were believed to be William Afton in either digital or physical form, the introduction of the Mimic, a character that takes on other people's identities and wears costumes to pretend to be something it's not, led to the now popular theory that William Afton actually did die in FNAF 6 or was just trapped in Ultimate Custom Night forever, and Burntrap and Glitchtrap are just instances of the Mimic copying William and making itself look like him, or at most being influenced by the leftover agony and memory of William and his actions rather than by William himself. After all, after base game Security Breach came out, a lot of media that's been released for the franchise explicitly focuses on the Mimic as the main villain. Tales from the Pizzaplex isn't in the game continuity, but its overarching story is about the Mimic's origin in the books, how its program got into the Pizzaplex by being used as a storytelling AI after being used for the same in VR and AR games, which sounds suspiciously similar to how Glitchtrap ended up in Help Wanted after circuit boards were scanned for pathfinding, how it ended up in the Pizzeria Simulator location, and just how dangerous it was. Then Ruin came out and revealed the Mimic as the main villain in the Pizzeria Simulator location. Help Wanted 2 had Glitchtrap, which already seems connected to the Mimic program with the backstory similarities, and Secret of the Mimic was all about the Mimic's origin in the games. While the Mimic Endo and Burntrap don't really look alike outside of a modified hand model that, despite popular belief, does not actually have markings that line up with Burntrap's corpse bits, it's not like the Mimic in Ruin looks much like its 1970s self from Secret of the Mimic either. And characters looking different over time isn't new to the franchise. Meanwhile, not only is the Mimic found in the same building where Burntrap was and is no longer found in Ruin, but there are claw marks that match the pattern of Burntrap's sharp metal and blunt bone fingers on the vent exiting the one in Burntrap's room and on the one going into the Mimic's room. Additionally, Glitchtrap in Help Wanted puts the player in a Freddy suit before dancing around the party room, while the Mimic in Secret of the Mimic does essentially the same thing, but instead just stares with one arm curled, which people have used to draw comparisons to Burntrap curling his arm when exiting his charging pod in Security Breach. Not to mention, we also found out from an interview with franchise creator Scott Cawthon that his original plans for Security Breach's main game, with Burntrap being used as an example, didn't turn out the way he meant them to, since he originally just told the developer, Steelbowl Studios, the pieces of the puzzle rather than the actual story those pieces were meant to form, but did start working more closely with them for Ruin, where the Mimic first shows up. Because of all this, the most common opinions I see are either that Burntrap is or was always meant to be the Mimic, with the claw marks in the vents showing that he relocated to the Mimic's room and got rid of all the Afton-y bits, or that Burntrap wasn't meant to be the Mimic while Glitchtrap was, but has essentially been retconned out of the story and is no longer canon thanks to not being implemented correctly, or that William may be involved, but since his soul is trapped in the nightmare coma that is Ultimate Custom Night, even if that is William's body or his agony influencing the Mimic into portraying itself as him, the Mimic is the one probably puppeting both Burntrap and Glitchtrap, not William's spirit. However, I think all of these interpretations overlook some really major details, and the evidence used to back them up either isn't quite as strong as people make it out to be, or actually contradicts the points they're trying to make. Take the Scott interview, for example. I see a lot of people say that Burntrap can no longer be considered canon or was meant to be the Mimic because Scott talked about how his original purpose for Burntrap was highly dependent on the character not moving, being kind of like a decaying movie prop you'd see up against a wall, only for the actual game to then give him a whole boss fight where he, moves. And that after Security Breach didn't turn out the way anyone wanted, he worked more closely with Steelbowl on Ruin and thought it redeemed the game. However, there are a few major issues with these readings of the interview. For one thing, if Burntrap was meant to be the Mimic the whole time, him not moving would be pretty counterproductive to that, since the whole point of the Mimic is that it moves around as it copies people. And I don't think that Burntrap's design is a miscommunication either, because Burntrap's hand was actually shown in an early trailer for Security Breach. And I find it incredibly unlikely that the game made it from that point all the way through the rest of development without Scott seeing what Burntrap looked like once. So I do think that Scott knew Burntrap looked like this and was okay with it. I find it much more likely that Scott just told Steelbowl to briefly include this character at the end of the game, intending him to be more of a Golden Freddy type character, which matches his description of not moving and looking like an old decaying movie prop. But then they ended up turning that brief inclusion into the boss fight, and here we are. For another, using the interview as evidence to say that Burntrap is no longer canon ignore some of the other context from the interview that implies that Scott still considers what we got in Security Breach to be the actual lore. When he brought up the stuff about Burntrap, it was only after saying that he was hesitant to share it because he didn't want to mess with the lore, which shouldn't be a concern if Burntrap and the rest of Security Breach weren't canon. It seems much more likely to me that the reason he was hesitant to share an example of what his original plans were was because he was worried that people would take his original plans and assume that was the actual lore, even though Security Breach is still the canon game we got. Additionally, in Ruin, we find out that Gregory created drawings of most of Security Breach's endings, including the Burntrap one. And considering the fact that he drew the blob, and we see the blob and Burntrap's charging pod and claw marks in Ruin that would distinctly have been made by Burntrap's bone and metal hand, not the Mimic's plain metal one, why would only the blob have been real and not Burntrap? Scott may have been working more closely with Steelwolf for Ruin, but either way, Ruin was still DLC to Security Breach. Him saying Ruin redeemed Security Breach is more likely to be about having a less buggy playing experience with a more comprehensible story, since he also said he wanted to make things right by the fans, and from what I remember, those were the main complaints about Security Breach in the first place. So I do think Burntrap canonically existed in the form that we see him in Security Breach. But even if Burntrap and Glitchtrap do both exist, what's stopping them from just being the Mimic pretending to be William and putting on his corpse bits or something? Burntrap's ability to hack Freddy and Glitchtrap emerging from the charging pod like Burntrap did seems to imply that the two are linked. Meanwhile, Glitchtrap and the Mimic have a lot of connections with how, based on the books and the games, both were used in VR games, both use fabric costumes, both are linked to the Vanny Mask, and both stick the player in a Freddy suit at the end of their games, potentially implying that the Mimic as Glitchtrap is repeating things it's already done. And Burntrap has the scratches in the vents leading to the Mimic's room. Not to mention, we know William Afton was being held in a nightmare coma during Ultimate Custom Night by the Vengeful Spirit, who I believe is the missing kid possessing Golden Freddy. I do acknowledge the people who think that Andrew from the Fazbear Frights books is the Vengeful Spirit, but if Tales from the Pizzaplex isn't in the game timeline, I doubt Frights is a one-to-one situation either, and Golden Freddy is the character we see in Ultimate Custom Night, not an alligator like the mask Andrew wears. But regardless, if William's mind is trapped in Ultimate Custom Night, how could he even be involved with what Glitchtrap or Burntrap actually do outside of maybe having some leftover emotions and memories haunt the Mimic after it puts on his corpse? Well, that question assumes that William had no way to leave Ultimate Custom Night. The thing is, we know for a fact that he can, since while the book's events may not have happened in the game timeline, they function off of the same world building. And William does manage to escape Ultimate Custom Night there. And not just escape Ultimate Custom Night, but his body entirely, hiding his presence as he followed the spirit who originally trapped him into a robotic dog that had its battery put into an animatronic known as the Stitch Wraith, until he finally made his move and took over an amalgamation of animatronic parts, fully acting as himself. While it wouldn't have happened the same way as in Frights, based on the Scott interview in Princess Quest, I think something similar happened with William and Glitchtrap. During the interview, Scott was asked about his thoughts on Glitchtrap, and in his response, he mentioned that he has a tendency to lean sci-fi. While people took this to mean that nothing supernatural was involved with Glitchtrap, that ignores what he said immediately afterward, which was that his tendency to lean sci-fi meant he loved the idea of possession of AI, machines, and circuitry, and that is why he loves the idea of Glitchtrap. In my opinion, this not only implies that Glitchtrap has supernatural stuff going on and isn't just the Mimic, but the fact that Scott uses the word possession here instead of the more passive haunted seems significant to me. While haunting is a term typically used for a spirit being present, possession implies that there's a spirit actively taking control of whatever is being possessed. And if Scott used this in reference to Glitchtrap, why would he do that if Glitchtrap wasn't a case of possessed AI, machines, and circuitry? It would make a lot of sense with Princess Quest after all. While the file name for the Princess Sprite was changed from Cassidy, one of William's victims, to just Princess, considering the number of things in the Princess Quest games themselves that connect directly to the Vengeful Spirit and Ultimate Custom Night, I think that change was more to avoid confirming the name Cassidy as the Vengeful Spirit than to say that the princess isn't the Vengeful Spirit. After all, that's a golden yellow character who has an enemy that's a rabbit character represented in purple, who gains the ability to fight back and is told to rest by a character that Help Wanted too heavily implies to be Old Man Consequences, with Chica watching in the background for part of the level. Meanwhile, Ultimate Custom Night is run by a character who has Purple Guy Rabbit Man William Afton as an enemy, fights back against him through Ultimate Custom Night, is told by Old Man Consequences to rest. Meanwhile, Chica has a line where she says she's the first and has seen everything. While Ultimate Custom Night doesn't show what happened next, I think Princess Quest does, with the princess ending up in a world representing Help Wanted, the game that Princess Quest was first revealed in, and also has a banner in the game saying "It's me," a phrase often associated with Golden Freddy. The stuff for the Mimic program, whether it be the M1 or M2 variant, would have been down in the Pizzeria Simulator location with William's remains, so who's to say he couldn't have either taken possession of, say, mixes, potentially explaining why it's suspiciously rabbit-shaped, other Mimic-related circuitry, or even had his own possessed circuitry mixed in with any circuit boards taken from one of the Mimics, which then allowed him to escape Ultimate Custom Night by having his consciousness linked to Help Wanted, Princess Quest, and the Mimic, also potentially allowing him to trap his tormentor in Princess Quest, which made the Princess Quest games we see possible. After all, to defeat Glitchtrap in the game, there are two items that are needed: a green rabbit plush, which which Help Wanted 2 associates with Glitchtrap, and a Vanny mask, which the Mimic uses a lot to communicate with Cassie in Ruin. In Help Wanted 2, we quite literally exchange the Vanny mask for the destruction of the Green Rabbit plush that turns into Glitchtrap, so I think it's incredibly likely that Glitchtrap is a case of William haunting the Mimic, with Help Wanted 2 essentially leading to his connection with the Mimic being destroyed, exchanging his control and the Green Rabbit plush's destruction for the Vanny mask, and therefore the Mimic being the one in control. So do I think the Mimic is involved with Glitchtrap? Yes. However, I think that as Glitchtrap, William was the one possessing it, as implied by Scott, up until his influence was purged. Because of this, I also don't think that Burntrap is or was controlled by the Mimic. After all, if Burntrap is just William, he would be connected to Glitchtrap via supernatural means, regardless of the Mimic's physical involvement in the matter. However, if Burntrap is just William, why would there be his claw marks in the vents leading out of his room and into the Mimic's room? Sure, the characters look pretty different, but Springtrap and Scraptrap, as well as the Mimic in the 70s and in Ruin, look different but are still the same character. Why couldn't this just be a case of, say, William trying to put himself back together as Glitchtrap using the Mimic as a base, only for the Mimic to remove all the William parts once it's back in control of itself? The thing is, while there is a claw mark exiting Burntrap's room and entering the Mimic's room, those vents aren't directly connected. The vent into the Mimic's room, while currently collapsed, appears to lead back into the same room as the Mix's machine, with a third claw mark visible. But this claw mark isn't entering the vent to go into the Mimic's room. This claw mark is exiting the Mimic's room back into the Mix's room. The only way for this to be the case would be if Burntrap entered both the Mix's room and the Mimic's room through that vent before it collapsed. And if Burntrap was the Mimic, that would mean he came out of the charging pod room and likely from there would have made his way to the Mix's room, crawled into the Mimic room through the vent, then crawled back out of that room through the same vent, but then went back into the Mimic's room for some reason. Alternatively, if Burntrap was William Afton, I could much more easily see it being the case where he couldn't go up without the blob being a problem, so he instead went down and tried to use the vents to get away from something, only for the vent in the Mix's room to take him into the room where he would see the hostile animatronic trapped in there that he would be familiar with due to trying to get it from Edwin, and then nope back on out of there to the Mix's room or something similar. That would cut down on the going in, coming back, and going back in. Not to mention with the concrete wall and Mixes being present, I think it's very likely that the Mimic was still trapped behind that wall during security breach and was only able to reach out once Glitchtrap was gone. On top of this, if the vent markings were meant to be a case of steel wool showing Burntrap entering, exiting, then entering the Mimic room again before shedding the corpse bits and springlock parts, you would think that at least some of Burntrap's parts would be lying around the area or in the Mimic itself, but as far as I'm aware, there's absolutely nothing to imply Burntrap was there other than those claw marks. The Mimic doesn't have Burntrap's springlock torso, doesn't have the bones, doesn't have the same leg design, doesn't have the same arm design. The Mimic doesn't even have the same hand that made the claw marks that are used to say that they're the same person. While Burntrap does look different from Scraptrap and the Ruin Mimic from the original Mimic, in both of those cases, those design changes and many others in the franchise can be pretty easily explained by the passage of time and modifications performed by themselves or outside sources. Similar to how we see in Help Wanted 2, how Roxy got her new mask in Ruin that she didn't have in Security Breach. Burntrap only has bone fingers on the arm that Scraptrap did have left, and could have used Glitchtrap's control over Vanny to repair the damaged or missing parts of his body, seeing as there's a whole bed set up in the Burntrap boss fight arena. As for the Mimic, there's a 50-ish year time gap between Secret of the Mimic and Ruin, so the idea that it would alter itself or be altered in that time isn't far-fetched, especially since we know from Secret of the Mimic that it was able to repair or rebuild its own legs. Meanwhile, for Burntrap to become the Mimic, every single part of his body would need to be swapped out, except for maybe a hand that, despite looking similar, is still different. While characters looking different between games happens, they're usually still recognizably that character. Scrap Baby looks similar to Circus Baby. Roxy in Ruin is still visibly Roxy from Security Breach. And Burntrap has spring body casing, human flesh and bones, and springlock suit parts, just like Springtrap and Scraptrap did. Of course, you are free to disagree with me, but I feel like if Steelwool and Scott Cawthon were intending to use Ruin to show that Burntrap was the Mimic, or that the Mimic was just wearing William's corpse, they would have actually made the two characters look like they could have been possibly made from the same base, rather than creating an entirely new model, considering how close together the events of Security Breach and Ruin are. And I think that takes priority, even if there happen to be a couple places where the Mimic is faintly lit with purple lighting, or they make a vaguely similar pose at one point. While the Mimic is a major villain, its involvement doesn't mean it has to be the only villain. And just because we don't know what's going to happen with Burntrap in the future, or if and when he'll show up, that doesn't mean he's irrelevant or can't be William. While I understand why people believe what they do about Glitchtrap and Burntrap being the Mimic, as time's gone on and we've gotten more information from both games and Scott's own thoughts on the characters, I become more and more convinced that it's a case of William possessing the Mimic program through Help Wanted, allowing him to act as Glitchtrap, which blends his own fursona as Spring Bonnie with the Mimic's penchant for fabric costumes, leading to his escape from Ultimate Custom Night and his ability to regain functionality in his original body as well. I don't expect everyone to agree with me on this, but if you do disagree, that's totally fine. The main thing I ask is that everyone please be considerate of opinions that don't match your own. At the end of the day, this is all fiction and meant to be something to have fun with. So I hope you enjoyed the video even if you disagreed, and consider subscribing if you did. So with all that said, make sure to check out Man to Sleep at the link link in the description, pinned comment, and QR code, or use code IDsFantasy on your order if you're interested in the 10% discount. Don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.